The doors were sealed. I could see the light bleeding through the seam at the bottom, a thin gold line that meant the grand hall was lit, active, and already full of every powerful being in the known galaxy. 11 minutes. I was 11 minutes late to the most important diplomatic event in human history, and a 7-foot guard with amber eyes and a ceremonial spear was standing between me and those doors with the patient stillness of someone who has turned people away before and expects to do it again. My name is Owen Fletcher, Junior Ambassador, Earth Diplomatic Corps, 3rd String. I was not supposed to be here at all. Ambassador Claire Donovan had food poisoning. Her backup, Deputy Liam Farrow, also had food poisoning. They had both ignored the bright red allergen warning on the Naihari appetizer tray at last night's welcome reception. The one printed in 4 languages, including English. The one that I had read clearly from across the room before deciding not to touch the tray. I had not attended the reception for long because I had been back in my bunk by the 2nd hour, studying language files on my datapad. I had also set my alarm to the station's 22-hour clock cycle instead of the 26-hour one my bunk terminal defaulted to. So here I was, uniform pressed, datapad charged, half a protein bar in my jacket pocket because I had not had time for breakfast, and completely, catastrophically, historically late to the grand summit of the Galactic Conclave, the meeting that happened once every 10 years, the meeting that would determine resource rights, border agreements, and species-level alliances for the next decade, the meeting that humanity had lobbied for 3 years just to attend as observers. The guard looked at me the way you look at something small that has wandered into a place where small things are not supposed to wander. His species, a branch of the Vithori line called the Selhari, had crest fins along the skull that functioned as emotional indicators. His were flat and pulled back. That meant either calm or skepticism. I could not tell which. I looked back at him and said, in Vithori clicking dialect, badly but sincerely, and with the particular care of someone who has been practicing a phrase for 6 weeks on a shuttle with mediocre audio files, I apologize for my lateness. I ask your patience. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever stood inside. Not the comfortable silence of a moment passing, the sharp silence of something unexpected happening to someone who is not used to being surprised. His crest fins shifted. They moved forward, and then settled into a position I had read about, but never seen in person. A slight lift at the rear edge. That meant something between surprise and reevaluation. He was looking at me differently than he had a second ago. He raised his wrist comm and clicked something into it too fast for me to follow. The message was short. The pause that followed was longer than I was comfortable with. I stood and waited, and tried to look like someone who belongs in places where he arrives late. The reply came back, flat and clipped. He looked at me for another moment, then he stepped aside. The doors opened. I walked in. The Grand Hall of Celestara Prime was designed by architects who wanted anyone entering it to feel the specific weight of their own smallness. The ceiling opened to space through a filtered dome, stars visible through the transparent panels above a chamber the size of a sports stadium. The floor was crystalline, pale and reflective, so that every delegate who walked across it saw their own image looking back up. The seating was arranged in tiered semicircles, the way ancient amphitheaters were arranged, so that everyone could see everyone else, so that there was nowhere to hide and no direction that did not put you in someone's line of sight. 230 alien dignitaries, 43 species, some of the oldest civilizations in the sector. Every one of them turned to look at me when I walked in. The presiding speaker, a tall Vethori diplomat in white ceremonial robes with a voice designed to fill rooms, stopped mid-sentence. The hall went silent in the way that only very large spaces can go silent, not empty but held, like a breath everyone is taking at the same time. My footsteps on the crystalline floor echoed. Each one was its own small announcement. The human section was at the back of the hall, a modest alcove with 3 chairs, positioned where a new and unranked species goes when the seating arrangement reflects status accumulated over centuries. 2 chairs were empty. In the 3rd chair sat someone who was very clearly not human. She was tall even seated, draped in robes that seemed to have their own weather system, shifting and moving in slow patterns that had nothing to do with air currents. The fabric cycled through colors, deep violet bleeding into silver, silver cooling into pale blue, blue pulling back to violet again. Her features were angular, precise in the way that suggests nothing is accidental. Her eyes entirely black and so deep that looking at them felt less like looking at eyes and more like looking at a direction. Bioluminescent patterns ran along her neck and wrists, pulsing in slow rhythms like something alive and calm underneath her skin. Behind her, two members of her personal guard stood in dark ceremonial armor, both of them rigid in a way that suggested they were very unhappy about their current position, but were not going to say so. I knew who she was without needing my datapad. Queen Sereth of the Nihari, ruler of 3 star systems and the political relationships between 17 others, head of state for longer than any human government had existed in its current form. She had attended every conclave summit for 4 decades. She had brokered the Meridian Accords. She had ended the Lethan-Pravi conflict that most species had considered unresolvable. She was, by any honest measure, the most consequential living political figure in the known galaxy. She was sitting in the human section, in the chair beside an empty seat. She had walked from her designated place at the highest tier of the hall, in front of every delegation that had arrived on time, and sat down in the alcove reserved for the species that had not yet earned a tier. I walked the full length of the grand hall. I did not hurry. There was no point in hurrying now. My footsteps continued to echo. I was aware of 230 sets of eyes following my path. I reached the human alcove, and I looked at the empty chair beside her, and I sat down in it. She did not look at me. Her robes cycled briefly through a color that was close to pale gold before returning to violet. The pattern under her skin pulsed once, strongly, and then settled. She said, in English that had no accent and no hesitation, the English of someone who learned it as a technical exercise and learned it completely. "You are late, Ambassador." I said, "I know. Thank you for waiting." She made a sound that was low and brief and came from somewhere in her chest. I would not learn until hours later, when a Nihari cultural aide explained it to me quietly near the end of the first recess, that the sound was laughter. The presiding speaker resumed. The meeting continued. I opened my datapad and tried to follow the agenda while also trying to understand what had just happened to me. During the first recess, the aide found me near the atmospheric recycler stations at the hall's edge and explained Velsha. She watched my face as she spoke, measuring my reaction, which told me the explanation was being calibrated to whatever I was prepared to understand. Velsha has no direct translation. The closest English approximation requires several words that do not quite fit together. The seat kept warm for the one worth waiting for. It is a formal act, ancient in Nihari culture, performed publicly and rarely. When someone of Queen Sereth's standing performs Velsha, they are making a declaration that every witness in the room is obligated to register. They are saying that the absent person carries worth that has not yet been recognized. They are placing their own credibility behind someone else's. It is not done lightly. It is not done casually. It had not been performed at a conclave summit in 31 years. Queen Sereth had watched the public corridor feeds that morning. She watched them, the aide told me. Every time a new species arrived, she had seen me pause on my way to the hall and spend time at a star chart mounted on the corridor wall. 40 seconds of standing still and studying it, curiosity winning over urgency, just long enough to be visible. She had seen me stop near a young maintenance worker from a low-contract service species who was sitting on the floor beside an open conduit panel and give him what I had in my pocket, which was half a protein bar. She had seen me speak to the Selhari guard in clicking dialect, poorly, but with genuine effort. 11 minutes of footage. She made her decision and she walked across the hall. The political current this generated moved through every delegation in the room. I could feel it without being able to read it clearly. The Vithori senior coordinator, a being named Aven, who wore his importance like a physical garment, was watching me during the recess with an expression that I could not fully interpret, but that felt like a problem being calculated. He came to me before the recess ended. He stood close enough to make the conversation feel private while making sure it could be observed, which was its own kind of statement. He asked me, in the formal polite register that the Vithori use specifically for condescension, what qualifications humanity brought to the conclave. His phrasing was careful. He listed our limitations accurately: 40 years of interstellar travel, internal political divisions that remained unresolved, No history of conflict mediation at the galactic level. No defended territories. No treaty obligations with any conclave member that predated this invitation. He did not say we did not belong here. He said everything that meant it without using those words. I agreed with him. All of it, genuinely and without defensiveness. Humanity was new. We were fractured and loud, and frequently made a mess of things at scales much smaller than this room. Everything he said was accurate. Then I told him that my species had sent me, specifically me, their third-string delegate, as their only representative to the most consequential meeting in our history, and that my first act had been to apologize in the right language to the man at the door, and my second act had been to walk across a room and sit beside a queen without asking anyone's permission. We make mistakes. We show up late. We give away food we cannot spare. We try languages we have not mastered yet. But we show up, I told him. Every time. We show up. Avon looked at me for a long moment. Then he walked away without saying anything, and I could not tell if that was a victory or a different kind of problem. Behind me, very quietly, Queen Serath's robes shifted to gold. The afternoon session started the way all afternoon sessions start, with slightly less patience than the morning, and slightly more history sitting in the room. The agenda had 9 items. We reached item 6, a standard trade corridor review, without incident. Item 7 was the Kravi-Lethan border dispute, 12 years old, 6 rounds of failed settlement talks, and a history of miscommunication that had outlasted 3 conclave mediators. The Kravi head delegate stood up to give the scheduled status presentation. He had been speaking for 4 minutes when he opened a secondary channel on the hall's frequency band and sent a signal that was not in his presentation and had not been cleared with the presiding speaker. A military readiness signal. Not a declaration, not a threat on its face, just the kind of signal you broadcast when you want the other side to know you are considering your options. The Lethan response came in less than 5 seconds. Their own signal, layered with a harmonic overtone that the universal translation systems flagged with a red indicator, an emotional intensifier encoding something between anger and the specific kind of grief that comes from being in the same argument for the 12th year in a row. The room fractured cleanly along species lines. Every senior delegation pulled back to their own section. The non-interference protocol was not spoken aloud because it did not need to be. Everyone knew it. Stay in your section, maintain neutral posture. Let the designated mediators engage. The designated mediators were the Vithori, and the presiding Vithori mediator had his notes in his hands and was standing completely still. I stood up. There is no version of what I did next that looks strategic. I had no authority and no backing and no leverage and no experience with a dispute at this scale. I stood up in the middle of an event horizon and started talking, and I did not stop. I did not propose a solution. I asked the Kravi delegate a question. Not what he wanted from the settlement, what he needed. The actual underlying thing that 12 years of border negotiations had been sitting on top of. The fear, or the loss, or the practical requirement that the coordinates in the trade agreements and the legal language were all just packaging around. He stared at me. I asked again, in simpler terms, because I did not have a better tool than plainness. He answered. The answer surprised the room. I turned to the Lethan representative and asked the same thing. She was more careful. I misread the emotional layer in her opening statement and had to correct my question out loud, in front of everyone, which is a particular kind of uncomfortable that I would not recommend as a diplomatic technique. But I did it without hesitation, corrected myself cleanly, and moved on, and something about that shifted her posture just slightly. She answered on the second ask. 40 minutes. I got facts wrong twice and corrected them both out loud. I made a cultural reference that was badly calibrated for 6 species and landed exactly right for 2 others, and I acknowledged the difference without apology. I ran out of formal diplomatic vocabulary 3 times and switched to plain English, slow and direct, and let the translation implants work harder than their standard settings were built for. I asked questions that had no clean answers. I kept asking until the shape of something started to appear in the space between the 2 delegations, not a resolution, but a framework, a shared acknowledgement of what each side actually feared, and a temporary signal freeze, and language they both agreed to bring to a working session before the next agenda item. I sat down. The hall was quiet again. A different kind of quiet than before. Queen Serath leaned slightly in my direction. She said quietly, "That was not diplomatic." I said no. She said, "Do you have a word in English for what you just did?" I thought about it. "Not a clean one," I told her. She said, "We do not have one either." The session closed at the 19th hour. The delegations moved out in the patterns that powerful groups move in when they are processing new information, some quickly, some in slow, deliberate clusters. I stayed in the human alcove after the last group had gone, too tired and too full of the day to move immediately. The hall lights had shifted to their overnight setting. The dome above was darker now, the filter reduced, and the stars were sharper and more numerous than they had been during the formal hours. I thought I was alone. Then I heard the soft, rhythmic movement of robes on the crystalline floor, and realized Queen Serath had not left with her delegation. Her guard stood far back near the main entrance, positioned at the distance she had indicated she needed. She walked to the human alcove and stood. She did not sit. She looked at the empty chairs, the ones that had held Claire and Liam in some version of this day that had not happened. She told me the truth directly, which I was beginning to understand was her only register. She said she had moved her seat that morning because she was bored. 4 decades of summits, every species performing the identical calculations, the same elaborate courtesy dances, the same long circles around the same fixed interests. She watched the new species because watching something new was the only way to feel the length of time she had been doing this. She had been ready to be disappointed by us. Most new species, she said, were disappointing in the same way. They arrived performing seriousness. They were so aware of being watched that they forgot to be themselves. She said she moved her seat because she recognized something in the corridor footage that she had not seen in a long time. She called it the expression of someone who has not yet been told which things are not worth caring about. I sat with that for a moment. I asked her what she had genuinely expected from humanity before this morning. She said, "Panic." Almost every new species panics when they understand the scale of what they have walked into. They either go very still or very loud. Both are forms of panic. I told her we panic too. We are actually quite skilled at it, but we tend to do it while still moving our feet forward. Her robes ran through 3 colors in quick sequence, colors I had not seen in any of my pre-mission reading and did not have reference points for yet. They stayed in the 3rd color for a moment before cycling back. She turned to leave. Her guard shifted at the entrance. Then she paused and looked back at me. She said the seat would be kept at the next summit as well. She said to try not to be 11 minutes late this time. Then she was gone, and I was alone under the stars with the station humming quietly around me and a very long report to write in the morning. I stayed in that chair for a while longer. I was thinking about the Velsha, about what it means when someone old enough to have watched civilizations rise and fall looks at 11 minutes of corridor footage and decides you are worth a public declaration. I was thinking about what we actually are, out here in a room built for beings who have been crossing the stars since before we had writing. We are new. We are late. We apologize in languages we have only halfway learned. We give away food when we are still hungry ourselves. We stand up in rooms where we have no authority and start asking questions that have no clean answers, and keep going until something moves. I do not know if that is enough to build a permanent place in a galaxy that has been running without us for centuries. I do not know if the framework I pulled out of the Kravi-Lethan session will hold, or whether Avin will ever finish the calculation he started during the recess, or what the 3 colors in sequence mean on a Nihari queen's robes at the end of a long day. What I know is this. I walked into the most important room in the known galaxy, 11 minutes late, alone, with a half-eaten protein bar and a mispronounced apology, and someone had already saved me a seat. We arrived late. We said sorry to the person at the door in his own language. We sat down without asking permission. We stood up when the room went quiet, and everyone else pulled back. We asked the wrong questions in the right order until something shifted. That is a deeply, specifically human way to begin. I think, for today, it was enough.